Alors tout d'abord, je vous remercie beaucoup de m'avoir invité à Namur. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici parmi vous pour discuter au sujet du développement durable. Je m'excuse tout de suite de ne pas vous parler tout à fait en français. Ça va beaucoup mieux pour moi, au moins, en anglais. Tout d'abord, mais je voulais dire à Jean-Pascal, veuillez-vous bien, s'il vous plaît, m'arrêter si je parle trop longtemps. Mais si vous soyez tenté de le faire aux manières que vous l'avez fait juste auparavant à Olivier discuter, faites attention, hein? Regardez bien ce que j'ai apporté avec moi pour me débattre contre tout ce qui vient. It's a pleasure to be here and in your final session and to see so many people. I want to talk to you about the concept of the green economy, and it's an excuse, of course, to talk a little bit about prosperity without growth, but mainly to address some of what I see as the core ideas of vision that sit within prosperity without growth, and to talk a little bit about my development of those ideas in collaboration with other people in the time since Prosperity Without Growth was published. And I'm calling it, I called the title Saving the Green Economy, because really the experience from Rio, which is where the term the green economy first achieved prominence, was not a particularly happy one. In fact, in Rio, the green economy was cashed out, if you like, almost literally, in terms of sustained economic growth. And if you read the document called The Future We Want, possibly, it mentions sustained economic growth something like 17 times in the course of the document, social justice once or twice, and ecological limits barely at all. And so the idea that we might need to save green economy actually is quite a powerful one. And I think it is still a useful term. It's still useful to say that the economy that we have at the moment is dysfunctional. It's not working well. It's still useful to say that one of the principal tasks, and it's by no means the only task, but one of the principal tasks for sustainable development is to build another kind of economy, another kind of economics. And it's that task that I want to talk about today. But let me, first of all, address the question of limits, the question of whether actually the future we want might be right, that green economy is really simply green growth, simply growing as fast as we can and doing the best that we can with technology. And I want simply to illustrate the complexity of that in relation to a sort of backstory. Rio last June was 20 years after the first conference in 1992. And I think there's an interesting backstory, if you like, a story from the history of those negotiations. And it goes something like this, cashed out in an equation that you'll all be familiar with, the famous sustainability or Ehrlich-Holdren equation, that impact is a product of population, affluence, and a technology factor. And the backstory is that in Rio in 1992, essentially, there were two parts of the right-hand side of that equation which were, for different reasons, completely off the agenda. And the first part was population, that one should not talk about population, even though the rich world wanted to point their finger very firmly at the poor world and say the problem is all in the growing numbers of people, and it's the poor world which has the fastest population growth. These are the guys who need to make the difference. The poor world, quite understandably and very, very justifiably, turned back on this and said, actually, guys, sorry to point this out, it's really about the levels of consumption in the rich economies. In other words, it's about affluence. And so the compromise was reached in 1992 and in the agenda that followed 92 that we wouldn't talk about either population or affluence in any great detail. And that left, of course, only one thing, which was technology. And so for about 20 years, we engaged in what I call here the battle of efficiency against scale. So it is really all about having clever technologies, introducing them as fast as possible, doing things more efficiently, achieving more with less, and running faster and faster with technology in order to overcome the impacts both of rising population and of increasing affluence. That has been really the story that led up to the idea of the green economy. And the green economy came into being, of course, after the crisis, and with the knowledge that actually the economy that we had was already, to some extent, broken. It was already illegitimate in achieving stability, let alone sustainability, even for the richest economies. And so green economy emerged in Rio as a term that might offer, if you like, a way of reconceiving economy. And yet, and this is why it was so disappointing, the future we want really attempted to equate green economy with green growth, to say essentially it's the same thing, to revert, if you like, to this same story that we'd seen for 20 years where technology was the route to salvation and the deeper issues of growth, population growth, and the growth in affluence should not be addressed. Now, I just want to illustrate very, very briefly why that is such a troubling story. It's troubling, certainly in historical perspective, because actually the journey from Rio to Rio, in terms of carbon emissions, was a very, very straightforward one. Carbon emissions rose inexorably, except for the years of the financial crisis and recession in 2008, 2009. So there was nothing there to suggest that technology had really done its job. We did have technological improvement. We had improvements in the carbon efficiency over that time of around about a third, but we also saw expanding GDP and in some cases accelerating GDP growth, which outweighed those gains in efficiency, and the result was rising carbon emissions. So in other words, in the battle between efficiency and scale, there was a very, very clear victor, and it was scale itself. We didn't make anything like the progress we should have made in terms of technological efficiency. I want to illustrate what the challenge would be of chasing this technological concept in the context of carbon limits as a very simple example. And here is a graph which simply illustrates the carbon emissions projected into the future if we take trend income growth, trend population growth, and trends in technological efficiency into account. And it's a story that looks unremittingly bad in the eyes of any respectable climate scientist. We're looking at a tripling of the global carbon emissions over the next 40 to 50 years. Of course, we can make technology work harder. And how would we do that? We would do it through renewable energy, through energy efficiency, through resource productivity, through reinventing processes and products, and we can do our very best to bring that curve downward, to bend it downwards. So here is a graph that simply shows the income according to trend and population according to trend, and a carbon intensity that declines around about 20-fold, which is around about 20 times faster than it has declined in the past. And this has to happen in the next 38, 37 years or so. So this is a technological possibility. I'm not standing here saying it isn't impossible. I'm simply saying here's the scope of the challenge if you want to meet the carbon targets which science tells us should be the boundaries around human activity. I want to take very quickly a closer look at that lower curve, because what's interesting about it is that it doesn't, in fact, represent a very equal world at all. It's still income according to trend. And what does trend mean here? It means the incomes of the developed, the richest economies growing in the way that we would like to hope for at around about 2% per annum. It means the incomes in the fast developing countries catching up quite fast, and the rest of the world, Southeast Asia and parts of Africa, languishing in the doldrums for decades to come. And so if we wanted to make that an equal world, if we wanted to say, well, okay, we'll keep this growth-based challenge and we will ensure that everybody, all of 9 billion people, achieve the same level of income that we hope for in the West by 2050, this pushes the curve upwards and has to come down faster. And in this case, this is a convergence to 50K. What you can see here, and what is important to climate scientists, is the area underneath this curve. Most climate scientists would argue that what we need to do is to bend that curve downwards by around about 2030. The peak of this curve is considerably later, and the amount of carbon in the atmosphere under this curve is considerably higher even than a business-as-usual scenario. I haven't asked technology to do any more work. It's already a fairly horrendous task to reduce the carbon that far. But what I did want to point out very briefly, without talking about degrowth or décroissance too much at all, I wanted to point out that a lot depends on what you choose as your convergence target for income. Are we looking at a world where everyone grows to around $50,000 per capita, as the rich countries expect to do by 2050? Or could we conceive of a world in which incomes converge to a lower value, around about $20,000 per capita? And here's the curve that corresponds to that. You see that we meet the carbon target more easily. The technological challenge is halved by comparison with the upper curves. We only have to reach around 40 grams of carbon per dollar of economic activity. And what is much more important for climate scientists is that the area under the curve, the carbon that's gone into the atmosphere, is almost halved as well. It is a considerably easier place to be if we conceive, if we are prepared to concede that actually the income convergence target shouldn't be the same as the rich world sees for itself now. It should actually be one which allows the poorest to grow. The per capita income in Africa, for example, is less than $5,000 per capita at the moment. It allows the industrializing nations to grow as well. The income in China and India is around about the $10,000 per capita mark. But it does require the richest economies to think about a different kind of economy. It's still a technological challenge, and the principal component of that challenge is not actually technological. Rather, it is about systems. Rather, it is about the kind of economy that we have. And so I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the kind of economy that we have, the kind of society that we have. The challenge is not just to have clever technologies. It's to have and to implement those technologies in the social conditions, in the social world within which we live. And so I want to talk very quickly about this socio-economic component of chasing green growth. And I do it really through a very simple diagram, a diagram well known to economists, which is called the circular flow of the economy. And here you see it in its simplest form, if you like, that firms producing goods for households, that's for us. And in return, we give to firms what are called the factors of production. And because we give those factors to firms, labor, capital, land, they in return give us incomes. And that's a nice thing because we spend those incomes on the goods and services that the firms provide for us. You can see it's a very nice, simple conceptualization of the relationship between producers and consumers, which sits at the heart of the modern society. I draw attention strongly to the fact that actually as consumers we tend not just to spend whatever we have in our pockets. We are motivated to save money, and we're motivated to put those savings into productive investments. And so there's if you like, a little bit of leakage from this circular economy through the banking system. And I'll come back to the banking system because it turns out to be of paramount importance in approaching solutions. A lot of that investment is dedicated towards increasing productivity in the economy, particularly increasing labor productivity, the efficiency with which we use people's time in work to produce goods and services. And it's a key driver of the capitalist economy. So this investment in increasing productivity is in some ways very good, because one of the things it does is to bring down prices. If you have less labor in your products, then you can produce them cheaper and more people can buy them. One of the drawbacks of that is you can see immediately as you make goods cheaper and cheaper that more people will buy them and will buy more of them. And so you have not just a simple circular relationship, but a relationship driven by an internal dynamic. There's another part of that dynamic that's also important, particularly when it comes to labor, to work. Because if you're increasing your labor productivity year on year, you need fewer people to produce the same quantity of goods next year than you did this year. And that means that unless your economy grows, there's somebody out of work. Unemployment is rising. So in this system, we're linked, we're hooked into growth by the drive for increasing labor productivity year on year. But there's another factor of this simple conceptualization of the economy I want to draw attention to, which is that we invest also in novelty. We invest in the new. Joseph Schumpeter 100 years ago called this creative destruction. He argued that what we're doing year on year is turning over the old in favor of the new, looking for new consumer products, new markets, new gadgets, new toys, new houses, new lifestyles, new experiences. And what is of most interest here is that this process of searching for the new, which is at the heart of the way that enterprise is conceived, is also at the heart of us as human beings. In other words, new things matter to us. Novelty is something that we like. And it isn't just that we like it in a bad way. It isn't just about status competition. It is also a dynamic that sits at the heart of the idea of prosperity, because prosperity is about hope. Hope is about a nice, bright, shiny future, a place in which new things symbolize that shininess to us, in which they signify hope. And the growth-based economy builds its sociology and its psychology around this idea of chasing novelty. If we are ever tempted to forget that, of course, there's a host of advertisers and investors and indeed politicians who will encourage us and provide cheap credit to us so that we can pursue this further and further year on year. But I want to dwell very quickly on this idea of that there's a kind of anxiety in this system. What do I mean by that? The anxiety of the firm is that if you don't play the game, if you don't invest in new, if you don't have new products, if you're not continually bringing new markets into your business, then your shareholders will flee. The anxiety of us, of households, was referred to over 200 years ago by Adam Smith as the desire to live a life without shame. And I want to just tease out some of the dimensions of that with you before passing on to the more important task maybe of saving the green economy. To lead a life without shame, Adam Smith suggested we need a linen shirt, for the want of which we wouldn't go out in public without shame, and hence my picture of the linen shirt. What's happened since, of course, and Amartya Sen has pointed this out very nicely, is that nowadays to lead a life without shame, to be able to entertain, to visit one's friends, to keep track of what's going on and what others are talking about and so on, requires a more, and he might have said more and more expensive bundle of goods and services in a society that is generally richer and in which most people have already, say, means of transport, affluent clothing, radios or television sets, and so on. Now, in some sense, what he's saying here is very recognizable, that we're caught in a kind of ratchet effect, a social ratchet, where the level of material affluence doesn't go backwards, it keeps on going forwards, and it's driven by these forces of social comparison, of shame, basic human emotions, towards more and more stuff. And yet there's another sense in which what Sen is saying here is puzzling, because he's saying this happens more in a richer society. He's saying in a richer society we need more of this stuff in order to live a life without shame. In other words, he's telling us we're trapped in a material ratchet of increasing impact if we want to lead decent human lives. And to my mind, it's really important to challenge that. It's also hard to challenge it, and I'm not sure how many of my audience will recognize the material person on the left. But this idea that somehow our material appetites are driven by strong forces in human nature, as strong as the urge for social and sexual selection, as strong as the urge to find oneself a suitable mate, as strong as the urges of the beasts and the bees and of nature itself. And this, to me, was summed up very beautifully in a study by the veteran researcher, consumer researcher, Russell Belk, in a study across 3 cultures, where he interviewed a range of people in those 3 cultures, and particularly young people, and asked them about their relationship to material things and the function of those material things. And there is this one wonderful response from one of the respondents, which simply goes like this: no one's going to spot you across a crowded room and say, wow, nice personality. It takes material stuff to do what? To make yourself stand out, to say, I am here, to talk to people around you, to communicate with our fellows, to give gifts to our family, to create social ties, to bring evidence to ourselves as well as to others of our own place in society. In other words, what I'm saying here is that the power of this desire to live a life without shame goes to the heart of what it means as human beings to be a part of society. It goes beyond that. It even, according to some people, goes to our highest aspirations and pursuits. The human animal is a beast that dies, said Tennessee Williams in the play Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. And if he's got money, he buys and buys and buys. And I think the reason he buys everything he can is that in the back of his mind, he has the crazy hope that one of his purchases will be life everlasting. You can't take it with you when you go, but you can sure as hell hope that there is something beyond the simple struggles of existence that holds out a concept of hope for you, for your children, for their children, for society itself, and even for a kind of transcendental sense of who we are and what we're doing here. And consumer goods, according to Grant McCracken, another consumer researcher, says that he says consumer goods allow us to sustain hope by suggesting that displaced meaning, the meaning that is so hard to reconcile with the struggle for existence of our daily lives, can be recovered. For goods to serve the cause of hope, though, he says, they must be inexhaustible in supply. We must always have more goods to make our bridges towards displaced meaning if hope is to spring eternal. My book is called Prosperity for a reason. Prosperity has its roots in the Latin for the word hope, and hope is a key element, it seems to me, of a system that actually, paradoxically, has undermined hope, both in terms of ecological impact, in terms of social justice, and in terms of even of economic stability. But my point here, and it is an important one, is that we cannot simply throw away the basis for that hope in our process of reconceiving the economic system. We have to allow it its proper place and its proper psychological and social understanding in our conception of a green economy. And that is, at first sight, a difficult thing to do. But here, to me, is a quotation from Mary Douglas and Baron Isherwood, which I think gives us, in fact, at heart, a very different conceptualization of what's going on. And their argument, essentially, is that consumer goods play a symbolic role in our lives as part of social conversations. So all of this stuff that we're using, perhaps to attract a mate, perhaps to cement our friendships, perhaps to show our love to our children, perhaps to survive on a day-to-day basis, is not simply functional stuff. And consumers, in pursuing it, are not just being irrational. Forget the idea of consumer irrationality, says Mary Douglas. Forget that commodities are good for eating, clothing, and shelter. Forget their usefulness and try instead the idea that commodities are good for thinking. Treat them as a non-verbal medium for the human creative faculty. And what is it that we would like to do with this language of goods? Actually, it's a very simple, very human task. The individual's main objective in consumption is to help create the social world and find a credible place in it. Actually, that's what we're all doing here today. We're helping create the social world and looking for a credible place within that. It's what we do in a lot of our lives. Believe it or not, it's what bankers do, it's what politicians do, it's what industrialists do, it's what entrepreneurs do, it's what people do. And this vision, actually, of creating the social world and finding our place in it actually does two things, I think. One is that it helps us to avoid the trap of saying the problem is out there. It's with the politicians who won't help, with the consumers who are irrational, with the producers who are irresponsible, with the bankers who are greedy, and it accepts that a portion of the responsibility lies in our own desire to do good, to be good, and to be in a good society. The second thing it does, actually, through that realization, through that understanding, is to free us a little bit from materiality, to free us from the goods themselves, to ask the question if what is going on in consumer society, rather than about simple acquisitive greed, is in fact about social credibility and conversation, then the task is to begin finding the conversations that will help us without the material input, to build a new kind of conversation. What is that conversation? It has to be something in which people are included. It has to be something which talks different languages. It has to be something which takes account of our fundamental desire to live as good people in a good society, and also to recognize that that doesn't always happen. It has to be a powerful conversation. It has to have the symbolism that is inherent in Madonna's Material Girl. It has to have the power that is inherent in dressing to impress when you're going out looking for a date. It has to have the power of story that convinces us that there's not just a beginning, not just an end, but a middle where our struggle to survive and to flourish is a meaningful endeavor. It has to have a sense of community. It has to persuade us that we can live together and work towards a shared endeavor. And in this vision of what a green economy can be, I personally can't see, and I challenge you to find it if you think it's there, I can't see that there is necessarily a conflict in relation to materiality. I can't see that it is beyond our creativity to invent a conversation in some language or another that doesn't rely on the evocative power of goods in quite the way that we did in the last few decades. And I believe our sources to find that can come from all sorts of places. I think we get beyond consumerism actually by having a more realistic sense of who we are as people. And that sense, of course, recognizes that we have selfish components, that we are sometimes purely selfish people. Of course, it recognizes that we are novelty-seeking, that we love new stuff. But it pitches both of these attributes of the human heart in a sort of tension. This diagram draws strongly from the work of Shalom Schwartz, who talked about a circumplex of human values. And his circumplex is built around these tensions, the tension between self and other, the tension between novelty and tradition. And he argues that, of course, the selfishness, the competition that looked as though it would enhance sexual or social selection in some context, of course, has an evolutionary basis. It really did work in the ancestral environment. And it works for us sometimes still today. But he points out that by the same token, we would never have evolved the way we have without the balancing components in our psyche, without the other regarding behaviors, without the sociality, without the tradition that lays down enough stability to bring up children and to flourish in the world. And so this is a vision, if you like, stemming from an analysis of the problem within us, the problem within us recognized as such, recognized as being our own desires, our own desire for the new, our own desire to create a worthwhile life, our own sense of our place in society, and yet transforming that in a way that recognizes the breadth of what it means to be human. And then instead of locking our economy, our institutions, our politics in the realm of the selfish, novelty-seeking consumer who does exist, who lives on the right-hand upper quadrant of my diagram, we accept actually that the human being is, as we have all known all along, a much broader, more interesting and deeper being. And this isn't simply a philosophical point for me, it's a point that then begins to tell you how to build the green economy, how to build the institutions that create the green economy, how to build the money system that creates the green economy, what to do with communities within the green economy, what to invest in the green economy. And I want in the final part of the talk to sketch very quickly some of what I see as the elements of that construction process. It starts with vision, but at the end of the day, it is, to some extent, a prosaic, intellectual, conceptual, and empirical task to build a different economics. How might we start with that? I identify broadly 4 components that I'd like to touch on briefly. And they are not at all unknown to us. The simple strategy of greening investment actually lives at the heart of the green growth strategy. You won't have a disagreement with the green growth strategy by arguing that we should have green investment. That is also a part of the traditional vision. Here is something that departs a little bit more from the traditional vision, which is that we need to reconceive enterprise. Enterprise needs not to be simply about the pursuit of profit through the degradation and depletion of material resources to create bubbles of value in the economy that shareholders can profit from. It actually has to reconceive enterprise as the provision of service to one another. The provision of those things that actually make our lives worthwhile. And again, it's about populating our sense of economy with a deeper and more robust and rigorous sense of our own needs as human beings. This does pose some challenges, and you will have picked up one of those already. The challenge of work and employment, for example, is absolutely key. So the productivity trap that I mentioned, that as productivity increases and increases, labor productivity increases, the economy has to grow and grow unless you want to face unpalatable unemployment. So you have to do something about that. You have to be able to escape that trap. And within all of this, actually what turns out to be of key importance is the role of money itself, and making sense of money and the money supply is the fourth element of this framework. You have to work out how these things fit together, so you have to have, if you like, an ecological macroeconomics. You have to have a theory of macroeconomics that makes sense of these things in relation to each other. And although this sounds like pure terminology, it's worthwhile pointing out that the macroeconomics we have simply does not have these components in them. It doesn't particularly recognize the ease and the extent to which we need to create green investments, which will have different targets from conventional investment, different ecologies of investment, different rates of return, probably lower financial rates of return in some cases, but with clear ecological and social rates of return. And it doesn't recognize that actually this investment has to sit within a different kind of money economy. The existing macroeconomics is one in which economic stability is driven by increasing consumer demand. And if you want any justification, any evidence for that at all you have to look at is how badly things go wrong in the face of a recession, when demand stagnates or falls. Likewise, this concept of enterprise as service doesn't really exist in the conventional macroeconomics. Of course, we're very used to dealing with enterprises delivering nutrition and material things to us. We're less comfortable, perhaps understandably, with the idea, in fact, that beyond those material things, enterprises could also deliver health to us, could deliver education to us, could deliver social care to us, could deliver renovation and maintenance, and the maintenance of gardens and parks, and the creation of ecological reservations, and the building and protection of ecological assets, that enterprise actually has a role to play in creating the assets from which services flow in the future. And there's an extraordinary thing about some of these activities, take health and education and social care, for example, is that they have the potential to have much lighter footprints, for the simple reason that the enterprise is not about the throughput of material stuff. In fact, it has an incentive to reduce the material stuff that it's using in the process. The enterprise is about the delivery of the service. And perhaps one of the most important things here is that these kinds of service enterprises actually have low productivity, low labor productivity, and low potential for labor productivity growth. This is a graph which illustrates that. It's some data taken from Europe over a couple of decades, and it just shows where this service sector, personal and social services, lives in the economy in terms of productivity growth. And it's captured by these blue bars in my graph. And what you can see here in the diagram is that the productivity growth over those decades was actually negative in many of the countries illustrated in the graph. At first sight, this looks devastating. And economists look at this and talk about the service sector as a disease. Baumol, the economist William Baumol, pointed to what he called the cost disease, that in a progressing economy with a transition to services, actually productivity falls progressively over time. And he pointed out the reasons why. And the reasons why are very simple, because at some level it doesn't make sense to have a doctor, say, seeing more and more patients every hour. You lose the value that's embedded in health as a service. It doesn't make sense to have teachers teaching ever bigger classes. It doesn't make sense to ask the London Philharmonic Orchestra to play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony faster and faster each year. And in this example, actually, you can see suddenly how this fetishism for productivity has been so counterproductive in our lives, that we have devalued the centrality of work in the enterprise that creates the foundations of society. And by bringing it back, one of the remarkable things here is actually that we then can escape the productivity trap. There are two main routes towards full employment in a less fast-growing economy. I'm not even going to mention degrowth. One is in relation to sharing work, actually working less, which is a vision that John Maynard Keynes had 80 years ago in a lovely essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And the second, the one that I'm highlighting here, is to shift the basis of economy towards the services that allow us to flourish as human beings in a society in which we belong and share in the vision of it. I'm going to skip over this model. You can find it in a paper. It really is just an illustration that once you have these principles to hand, you can play with them. And this is something that not just academics, but researchers and politicians and research institutes and think tanks and ordinary people actually quite enjoy doing. What we're playing with is the art of the possible. What we're creating is visions of possibility. And what you can show is you can build different scenarios of the future in which you play with these elements, with green investment. How much green investment do we think we could get into our economy? How much work sharing and work time reduction could we get into the economy? How much shifting towards a service-based sector could we get into the economy? And these diagrams show a little too complexly, I suspect, for this time of the evening. But what they illustrate is that you can maintain employment levels using these strategies in a variety of different ways, even within a conventional economy. You'll see that some of these, the second scenario and my third scenario, are degrowth economies as it happens, but they maintain full employment by reducing working hours and shifting the basis of economic activity. What am I illustrating here? Really simply that there is possibility here for reconception. It's a task that I've been engaging with, in particular with an economist called Peter Victor in Canada over the last 2 to 3 years since Prosperity Without Growth was published. And I'm doing it because that's what I said in the book, that actually this is the principal task for economics, is to devise a macroeconomics that works. It works by incorporating the concept of natural limits, by exploring the relationship to the financial economy, and by putting the two things together. And sadly, Jean-Pascal, in spite of my warning, is lurking to my left-hand side, so I really can't show you anything of what comes out of the model. As it happens, there isn't a great deal to show at the moment because the task has proved to be Herculean. But I will just point to one of the features that has come out of it, which is the role and the nature of money. And money is a very, very complex thing, but it's governed by some simple relationships. Here is one of those relationships. It says private net savings is exactly equal to government borrowing. Think about that for a moment. Remove X minus M, which is trade, from the equation, because in a global closed economy there is no trade. And think about this. If we want private people to save, to increase their net financial worth, this can only happen if governments increase their debt. The relationship is that simple. These calls in austerity economics, both for private savings to be increased and for the public debt to be reduced, simply make no macroeconomic sense. And so this equation, one of the most basic fundamental equations of the national accounts, tells you where you are if you're in Germany. If you're in Germany with a healthy export sector, with lots of BMWs going to China, then you can afford to reduce your government debt at the same time as people are building up their savings. But you can only do this as long as you have consumers somewhere prepared to borrow in order to consume the goods that you're producing in your export market. And you can only do this if there are debts somewhere else in the system. And this is a way, if you like, of taking the fear out of the problem of debt and beginning to understand where solutions come from. One of the places they come from, and it's very early days, is through recognizing that there are trade-offs in the money economy in order to achieve the investments that you want in the green economy. And that these trade-offs are value-laden and sometimes ideologically driven. Let me just briefly mention the process of money creation. Most people think that governments create and print money. The reality is that 97% of money is created by debt in commercial banks. And this is an ideological position. This is a position which embodies injustice and inequality in its framing and which is ripe for deeper consideration. And I'm very pleased that there are people out there doing that work because it's one of the things that's proving necessary in modeling of a different macroeconomics. Getting beyond the dilemma of growth requires this kind of exploration. It requires alternatives which are real, people out there doing it. Shared interest is a vehicle for a different kind of investment. It supports the fair trade label, for example. Here's a community fund in the United States that takes local savings and invests them in the local community. Here's an example that you've probably seen before of a web search engine that dedicates 80% of its revenues to ecological investment. Here is an investment fund in Ecuador that seeks to keep oil in the ground and improve people's livelihoods in the Amazon region. These are all examples, small examples of things that are already happening. The bigger task of exploring these possibilities and creating a sustainable macroeconomics remains. The task at the end of the day in achieving prosperity is to maintain hope for a decent society and for a credible place in it. It consists in our ability to flourish as human beings, actually only partly in material ways. More than that, it is about the conversations that we have with each other, the social conversations, in whatever language we can achieve them, and sometimes even by not talking at all.